Liberalism section. The colonial question and the differential development of radicalism in France, England, and the United States. Reference has sometimes been made to, quote, philosophic radicalism, in connection with Bentham and his school. The theorist of utilitarianism adopted a debunking tone towards his country's political, legal, and ideological tradition. He did hesitate to denounce the, quote, almost universal corruption that raged in England, and the ill-starred role of a, quote, corrupted and corrupting aristocracy. He did not even spare the Glorious Revolution, despite the religious aura habitually surrounding it. The, quote, original compact, the compact between king and people, was a fabulous one. The supervening compact, the compact between king, lords, and commons, was but too real a one, end quote, and sanctioned the domination of an oligarchy. However, it is sufficient to look at the attitude Bentham took towards the liberal tradition's exclusion clauses to realize that we are very far removed from radicalism in the sense specified here. Of the refuse and dross, and those confined in workhouses, we have already spoken. We must now concern ourselves with the condition of the blacks. Bentham included, quote, the still unabrogated sanction given to domestic slavery on account of difference in color, among the imperfections of detail, to be found even in the, quote, matchlessly felicitous system of the United States, end quote. Starting from this rather euphemistic description of the institution of slavery, the English liberals stressed that a project of emancipation must proceed with extreme gradualism and be implemented exclusively from above. In a text from 1822, we come across a significant declaration, quote, the French have already discovered that the blackness of the skin is no reason why a human being should be abandoned without redress to the caprice of a tormentor, end quote. We are led to think of the abolition of slavery in the French colonies, but instead, as the note makes clear, the reference is to Louis XIV's Code Noir. As for gradualism, this was necessary for the purposes not only of respecting, quote, rights of property, which must be compensated for the loss suffered, but also of educating slaves for liberty. Bentham wanted an emancipation, quote, lottery that might occur at the moment of hereditary transmission of this special property, and from which 1/10 of the slaves owned by the deceased could benefit. An appeal to masters to demonstrate flexibility was the counterpart of indignant condemnation of any initiative from below. Beginning of long quote. The injustice and the calamity which have accompanied precipitate attempts form the greatest objection against projects of emancipation. This operation need not be suddenly carried into effect by a violent revolution, which, by displeasing everybody, destroying all property, and placing all persons in situations for which they were not fitted, might produce evils 1,000 times greater than all the benefits that can be expected from it. End quote. Unquestionably, the prime site of the formation of radicalism, in the sense I have defined it, was France. It is easy to see why. The country was favorably disposed to accommodate it following the defeat in the 7 Years' War, and the loss of a large number of colonies. Subsequently, the controversy that developed either side of the Atlantic on the occasion of the English colonists' rebellion ended up discrediting both factions of the Liberal Party. The American Revolution, with its development of relations of equality within the white community, and clear demarcation from the world of feudal privilege, galvanized harsher criticism of the Ancien Regime in France, and the crisis of the English model. Disenchantment with the non-abolition of slavery in America, and the emergence of an unprecedented racial state, also threw the American model into crisis. The roots of French radicalism lay in this dual crisis. But what was its influence across the Channel and the Atlantic? The problem can be reformulated as follows. liberal England, derived from the Glorious Revolution, and especially the American Revolution, made a powerful contribution to the ideological preparation of the French Revolution and, subsequently, through the crisis of the two models, to the formation of radicalism. But why did the latter not seem to take deep root in the two classical countries of the liberal tradition? Obviously, the vexed course of the Revolution and the explosion of the Terror immediately damaged France's powers of attraction. A far from negligible role in frustrating the diffusion of radicalism was also played by repression. In England, in 1794, habeas corpus was suspended for 8 years. A further suspension followed in 1817. While 2 years later there occurred what has passed into history as the Peterloo Massacre, or, to put it in the indignant words of an English paper of the time, the, quote, slaughter of defenseless men, women, and children, unprovoked and unnecessary, end quote. Suffering deportation to Australia and meeting with a horrible fate, sometimes dying under the lashes of merciless flogging, were members of workers' societies, clubs that were, or more or less Jacobin in orientation, and Chartists engaged in the struggle to extend the suffrage, not to mention Irish dissidents, for whom, quote, Australia was the official Siberia at the turn of the century. In total, quote, between 1800 and 1850, about 1,800 were deported for political, quote, crimes. Among them were representatives of nearly every protest movement known to the British government. End quote. Obviously, the repression also struck circles that regarded violent revolution by black slaves as legitimate, or even invoked it. In 1798, the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed in the United States, containing serious restrictions on constitutional liberties, granting the president a wide range of discretionary power, and particularly hitting followers of ideas suspected of being influenced by the French Revolution. And we already know about the violence, predominantly from below, to which abolitionists were subject. However, neither the terror in France nor the repression in Britain and the United States suffice to explain the weakness of radicalism across the Channel or the Atlantic. The analysis must be taken further. In England, the outbreak of war made it possible for the dominant class to present as a patriotic duty the struggle against the revolutionary fanaticism raging in France, and which threatened to spread to Ireland, posing a mortal risk to the British Empire. As for the United States, it is interesting to observe the debate which, on the eve of the war against Britain that broke out in 1812, involved two prestigious representatives of the South. The first, Randolph, declared himself against the opening of hostilities. The situation was full of peril on the home front, where the, quote, infernal principles of French liberty risked provoking a revolt by the slaves. Quote, the French Revolution has polluted them. End quote. Calhoun, by contrast, did not share these concerns. Certainly, attention should be paid to the slaves' moods, but happily, quote, more than one half of them never heard of the French Revolution. End quote. So, radicalism, with its recognition of the right of black slaves or Irish semi-slaves to take up arms against their masters, posed a serious threat to the stability of the United States and the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The lesser weight of the colonial question, or of populations of colonial origin, also helps explain the greater diffusion of radicalism in France. When the Black Revolution in Saint Domingo broke out, radical circles in Paris had no great difficulty recognizing and legitimating the fait accompli. Even if there was a risk of losing the remaining colonies, as anti-abolitionists never tired of warning, that would not be an irreparable tragedy. The situation was different when it came to Britain and the United States. The Black Revolution in Saint Domingo provoked a wave of indignation in both countries. Quote, a black state in the Western Archipelago, wrote the Times, is utterly incompatible with the system of all European colonization, and hence, Europe will, of course, recover in that quarter the ascendancy and dominion which it justly claims from the superior wisdom and talents of its inhabitants." End quote. The United States not only refused to recognize the country born of a black revolution, but did everything it could to isolate, weaken, and overthrow it. Jefferson distinguished himself in this operation. At first sight, he seems closest to radicalism. In January 1793, without allowing himself to be impressed by the charges against the Jacobins leveled by his former private secretary, referring to Paris, he spoke of, quote, "streets literally red with blood." He continued passionately to defend the, quote, "cause of the French Revolution." Quote, "Rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated. Were there but an Adam and Eve left in every country, and left free, it would be better than it now is." End quote. Moreover, Jefferson positively contrasted France with the United States, where Anglophiles regarded the 1787 Constitution, with the very wide powers it conferred on the president and executive, as a first step towards the establishment of a monarchy. Yet, the picture changed markedly following the Black Revolution in San Domingo. We know that Jefferson interpreted the principle of equality in radical fashion, but always within the ambit of the white community. He never believed in the possibility of whites and blacks coexisting on an equal basis. It would represent an unjustifiable challenge to, quote, "the real distinctions which nature has made," and end in the extermination of the one or the other race. End quote. When the conflict between white owners and black slaves exploded on the Caribbean island, the North American statesman's sympathy immediately went to the former. His anxiety about, quote, "the revolutionary storm now sweeping the globe" was profound. Hence his support for the invading army sent by Napoleon, which did not cease even in the face of recourse to revolting practices, such as the introduction of trained dogs to tear blacks to pieces, and the organization around such events of mass spectacles, at once thrilling and educative. End of section.